Christian, thank you. Back here, we're trying to again piece together the final moments of the 4 airline flights yesterday, specifically United Airlines Flight 93 that went down in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Miles O'Brien tracking that with more information of what may have taken place on board before that plane crashed. Miles?
Well, Bill, let's remind our viewers once again of the flight path of United Airlines Flight 93. Take a look at this information, which comes from Flight Explorer. This is based on Federal Aviation Administration radar data. The plane left Newark Airport at 8:43 in the morning, flew all the way out toward Cleveland, did a 180-degree turn, flew over Pittsburgh, and then ultimately crashed in the Somerset County area. There's a good look at that track without it animated. You can see exactly what it did. The big mystery has been, why did it go down there when it appeared to be homing in on the Washington area? Well, we've just heard from some people who had a relative on board that plane, Mr Glick, who was traveling with his 2-month-old child, Emerson. During the course of when it became apparent this was a hijacked aircraft, he called home. In the course of that conversation, people at home, his mother and his wife, called 911 operators, conferenced them in. But during this conversation, it became evident to Mr. Glick that there had been a plane which had crashed already at the World Trade Centers. He put the phone down, according to his family members, shortly, came back on the line and indicated that he had just taken a vote among the men on board this plane, and there were a total of, it was a sparsely populated plane, only 38 passengers, had taken a poll of the men on the plane and had made the decision to try to overpower the hijackers. We don't know what happened then. The line went dead. We do know that this particular flight did not make it to the Washington area. There has been some supposition that it might have been intended to strike the Capitol, perhaps. Camp David is one of the targets. We don't know that for a fact, but the fact is there was a vote, according to a member of a passenger on that flight, a vote to overpower the hijackers. Subsequent to that, that flight apparently went out of control and crashed into this rural part of Pennsylvania. Just one more piece of the puzzle here as we go through these flight paths and piece together this information. Almost each of these flights has at least one phone call or some sort of conversation or air traffic control communication which is giving us some sort of insights as to what was going on board. Bill?
And Miles, and while we discuss this, was there any information given? The Attorney General described 3 to 6 men on each airplane. Any description given of the hijackers at that time and the number on board that plane?
Well, there was a description that was given. I cannot relay it to you right now. I don't have that information. There was an indication that there were 3 hijackers on board that particular flight. We have heard that on some of the others there were 2, but in this case we heard there were 3 hijackers on the flight.
And Miles, I know you're a pilot. What strikes me from yesterday, these large airplanes, 757s, 767s, the very few number of passengers on board each one. And also, if you look at the weather across the country yesterday, very few delays possible anywhere because basically there were clear skies yesterday. One would think in the planning and the detail, this would have to be the case in order to avoid any possibility that one flight could be delayed in another part of the country or in another city. Have you picked up on that as well?
Well, I mean, we are getting a little bit into the area of speculation here, but the fact that it was a clear day is quite remarkable. There's a couple things to consider. First of all, as you pointed out, less likelihood of a serious series of delays, which would have undermined the timing of all of this. But another thing to consider as well is the fact that this aided navigation, aiming for those targets. If you presume for a moment that the hijackers were in control, and every pilot I've talked to a person tells me that the 3 flights that were successful at hitting those targets were undoubtedly controlled by the hijackers. If you accept that supposition, you're talking about someone who may or may not have a tremendous amount of aviation experience, perhaps very limited aviation experience, and might be just flying by what pilots call dead reckoning. In other words, pointing out landmarks and aiming toward them. If that were the goal, a clear day is the kind of day you'd want to have so you could pick out the coastline, find New York, and aim for the World Trade Center.
And back to the computer behind you, Miles, and the path that you're tracking right now. The reason we can do that simply is because there was still a signal emitted from that plane on board, correct? And that was not the case on every plane yesterday.
Here's what we've basically been able to determine. Let me just show you. This is the track of the 2 flights which ultimately hit the World Trade Center. This information that we have for you is compiled by the FAA radar centers. There are actually two centers involved, Boston Center and New York Center, radar rooms essentially, which compile all of this information about these airplanes. We have some erroneous information about the altitudes, which it's kind of a complicated technical issue, but the bottom line is we wouldn't have that much information if a device called a transponder was not operative on these aircraft. The transponder essentially enhances the signal and allows radar systems operated by the FAA to learn a lot more about an aircraft, its altitude, its position, what sort of aircraft it is. Gives a much more fine-tuned piece of information to them. So we have that information for this, for example, American Airlines Flight 11, and that's exactly the radar track. We got about a radar hit every minute or so. But the flight, which ultimately landed at the Pentagon from Dulles, took off, went somewhere for an hour and 20 minutes or so. We don't believe we have comprehensive radar tracking information on that. The supposition is that someone turned off that transponder. And if, in fact, you were a hijacker trying to engage in subterfuge, turning off that transponder, which essentially makes you more visible to FAA radars, would be something you might want to do.
And Miles, just back to the computers, we watched the two lines come out of Boston, head directly south. It appeared to me, if I could see the small print correctly, the American Airlines flight was the first one we tracked. The second one out of Boston, United Airlines, went further south before banking back around over the skies of New Jersey into New York. I'm sorry, Miles, got to cut you off quickly here. Hopefully we'll come back to this in a moment. But in the meantime, to New York, Aaron Brown with more information. Aaron?
Bill, thanks. That's just an extraordinary piece of information, a lot of it, but just highlight again that the men on board that flight, at least according to one of the passengers, took a vote and decided to try and overpower the hijackers on board. Whether they did that, whether that contributed to the crash, we don't know now. We may never know. But that's what an extraordinary moments those must have been. As we look behind